So good morning and welcome to March. We're almost to the official start of spring, and weather and conditions are starting to, seems like winter's loosening its grip, spring's right around the corner. So as we're continuing our message series talking about famous or most inspirational verses as we walk through the Bible. We started in January in Genesis, in the beginning with creation. We've worked through Moses and the people, the Israelites, coming out of Egypt. We've went through Psalms and Proverbs and King David and King Solomon's reign. And, we introduced Isaiah a couple of weeks ago and Jeremiah last week. We're in a period of time of the prophets, where God is speaking through prophets to the people of Israel who are trying to find their footing. And we know from last week's message, we're in a period right now where the Israelites have been invaded by the Babylonians. Most of the young people and the families have been split up, taken into exile. Jerusalem is ravaged, it's war-torn, and all that's left is a few scattered people, a lot of elderly people, and there's just lots of pain and devastation happening. And we can relate to that in today's world. Today's verse is coming from a book written by Jeremiah. Jeremiah had warned the people that they had gotten far away from God. They started believing in their own self. They'd conquered some land and they'd established themselves, and they kind of got full of pride. Look what I did. Look what I've built. Look how much wealth I've accumulated. Look at the city. And they got away from God. And they were warned that all good gifts come from God, and they were starting to abuse the worship in the temples and religion, and the religious leaders were taking power. They weren't following God's law by taking care of the poor and the neglected, and then the greed was kicking in. And the Babylonians sweep in and catch them with their guard down. And Jeremiah writes in a book today. He wrote the book of Lamentations. And that's where our passage of the week's from. Now, when you think about your favorite books in the Bible, how many would say Lamentations? That's my favorite book. I read it all the time. Love that book. Probably nobody. Because if you understand, Lamentations comes from the word lament, which is grieving, sorrow, mourning, crying. It's a book of devastation and grief because the Israelites are in the middle of this period of exile and captivity, and their world has been shattered. And Jeremiah is writing this book about them pouring out their sorrows and their grief and their anguish. And yet in this book, in chapter 3, verse 22 through 23, he writes and says these words of hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Now, we've all heard that phrase, great is your faithfulness. Your mercies, your compassions are new every morning. That comes from the book of Lamentations. It comes from a period of sorrow and distress, and their lives are totally wrecked. And this passage is usually weaved in these verses from 19 through 26 to put it in comment, and I'll read those. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those who hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Now, why is this verse famous? These words have inspired songs, prayers for generations because they speak directly to people who feel like they've hit rock bottom. They remind us that God's mercy doesn't run dry. If you grew up in a small church like I did, you had the old hymn, the hymn books. We didn't have screens with the songs and the words up on the wall we could all look at. We had actual books that you had to turn to a page number and sing a song. And one of the greatest hymns of all time is "Great is Thy Faithfulness." It's right up there with "Amazing Grace" and some of the other classics. And you'd sing, this song was constantly in the rotation. You'd hear it every couple Sundays. And it comes from this book of Lamentations. And it reminds us that no matter what we're going through in life, God is faithful and He's always there. Faithfulness sometimes just means being there, being present. Bob Green was a man in Chicago. He just lost his job. And he was devastated and going through a difficult time. And then unexpectedly, his wife passed away. And Bob had 2 young kids, and Bob was devastated at the loss of his wife. He had a quick private funeral, and he was hitting rock bottom. He was consumed and overwhelmed with darkness. He didn't want to talk to anybody. He didn't want to speak, go outside. He did not want to do anything. And after his wife's service, when he got home, it took all the strength he could muster just to feed his kids and put them to bed. And he just sat there in his bed all night, just weeping and mourning. His life shattered. And his phone buzzed, and he looked over there and he saw the word Jack. Jack was his best friend. And he didn't want to talk to Jack. He didn't want to talk to anybody. So he just rolled over and went through a tossless night. Well, the next morning he wakes up and looks at his phone. He sees Jack's left a voicemail. So he plays it reluctantly. And his friend Jack says, "Hey, I just heard the bad news. And I took the first flight I could to Chicago." Jack lived halfway across the country. He says, "I'm just down the road in a hotel. But I'm just going to sit here in case you need me. And if you don't need me and you don't want to talk, that's totally fine. If you need nothing from me, I'm good. But I just want you to know I'm here, and I'll be here the rest of the week." Bob went through 2 more days without calling Jack. And Jack sat in that hotel on standby. And finally, on day 3, Bob called Jack and said, "Yep, I need you, come on down." And within minutes, Jack rolled in his driveway. They had a quick embrace. Jack had brought donuts for the kids. And Jack and Bob sat on their front porch for hours, and not one person said a word. Not one word was said. They just sat there and stared at the street. Until lunchtime, and Jack quietly stood up, got the kids, took them to lunch, took them to the grocery store, showed back up, brought Bob some food, went back out on the porch, and they sat there the rest of the day. And at the end of the evening, he left and went back to his hotel. And they spent the entire day, and neither one of them spoke or said a word. And this went on for several days, the rest of the week. Jack would pull in, take care of the kids, do anything around the house that needed to be done, and he just sat with his best friend. And he showed us that faithfulness is really about just being there. No fancy words, no speeches, just being present and meeting the needs that he saw. It inspires and reminds you of this verse, that no matter what's going on around us, no matter how dark and alone we may feel, we've got a friend in Jesus who's always present. He's just sitting there. He's waiting for us to tell him what we need. And if he sees a need, he'll just meet it quietly, without any announcement, without any fanfare. But his presence is just comforting and there. If you talk about a short explanation of the verse, Lamentations is basically, it's a book of grief. The author, Jeremiah, writing this during this time, was surrounded by total loss, destruction, and despair. Everything felt broken. In the middle of the darkness, he said something surprising. He reminded the people, God's love is still here. His compassion has not failed. His mercy is brand new with every sunrise. Now, this is not denial. He's not denying the situation and how dire and gloom it is. The writer did not ignore the pain that everybody was going through, but he faced it head on, and he still chose to hold on to hope despite the circumstances. What he discovered is something that a lot of us long for and we search for and we wrestle with, even when everything else falls apart. God's faithfulness does not. Rosemary and Luther Smith lived in Kentucky, and one night they got the phone call that every parent dreads. They got a phone call that their 2 sons had been killed in a horrible car accident. And Rosemary was crushed. She didn't know how she could go on without her two high school boys. And when they were leaving the funeral site, she heard the bells toll, and she counted 33 times the bells tolled. And she remembered, for some reason, Jesus was exactly 33 years old when he lost his life. And she thought about the pain the Father must have felt. And to her, it was a reminder that he was there and he understood her pain. And what was miraculous, she sat there and realized the combined age of her 2 boys was 33 years old when she heard those bells. Not knowing what to do and going through a dark time, she felt God calling her to use this moment. And she sprung into action. She heard about another family that had lost a child. And she put together some passages that she'd been relying on, a little book of grieving for a parent who's lost a child, and she burned a CD with some of her favorite songs that were Christian songs that were comforting her. Now, don't get me into burning CD, because most people don't know what that is unless you're old like me, so I won't even go into cassettes, 8-tracks, and vinyls. But there was actually a time you had to go find and pick your music. It just wasn't on a phone. And she put together this care package and sent it with a comforting letter and an email address to this family. You don't know me. I can relate. I've been through this. I'm here if you need me. This stuff helped me. And she got a wonderful response back. And she thought, I've got a purpose. Even in my pain and misery, God still has a purpose. I just have to look for it. And her husband started an organization called Fellow Travelers. And it was a group of parents who had lost children and were still traveling this earth without their children. They called it Fellow Travelers. And they sent out booklets, passages, music, and care packages. And what they did is they searched obituaries and internet. And they ended up, very shortly, they had sent over 5,000 care packages all around the globe. And it's a growing movement and a growing organization. And it teaches us that even when we're in our pain and grieving, it's not denial to still realize God is faithful and he still has a purpose for everything and a plan, even when it makes no sense, even when the pain is deep and personal. His faithfulness is there every morning. So think about that. Every morning you wake up, you get a fresh start. It's a new day. Yesterday's failures, they don't cancel today's compassions. God is patient, he's present, and faithful again and again. I recently went and saw the movie I Can Only Imagine 2, which is the follow-up to the Mercy Me when they wrote what's considered the greatest Christian popular song of all time. And it talks about their struggles trying to write their next hit. And the story kind of unveils how they got to the big hit, Even If. But in that movie, they tell the story of Horatio Spafford. Now, Spafford's life, and we've shared this story before, he wrote us a hymn and a book, a famous book called It Is Well With My Soul. And this story is weaving into the movie. Horatio Spafford was an investor in Chicago in the 1870s. He was a lawyer and he was an investor in property and real estate. And he built a massive empire of property and buildings in Chicago. And in 1871, the Great Fire of Chicago hit, and he lost everything in one night. There were no fire codes back then. There was not escape ladders, fire suppressors. And when the buildings went, blocks would just burn. And insurance really wasn't a thing then. So literally everything he had invested in life was into these properties. And it was wiped out. In one night, he went from being an extremely wealthy man to a man that was not sure where he'd go from there. And as he was trying to rebuild his fortune, the recession of 1873, there was a big recession hit and wiped out what he had tried to rebuild again. And he was getting ready to go back to England to help Dwight Moody with an evangelistic mission that was going to bring more evangelism to the States. And he was sitting there, and there was a big forum in a business meeting to talk about zoning and fire, and he's trying to get buildings rebuilt and get his life back in order. So he tells his wife, Anna, and his girls to go ahead and go over on a boat, and I'll be there shortly. And as they were traveling across the Atlantic, they get struck by another boat, and the entire boat sinks, and 226 people die, including all of his daughters. His wife was one of the very few survivors. And back then, there was no newscast, there was no cell phones. Communications were slow, and it could take days. He heard about the ship wreck, and he sat there and waited. And there's still a famous telegram that exists today that came from his wife that had two words. It said, "Saved alone." And he knew he had lost all of his daughters. So he quickly got on the next ship and headed back to England to be with his grieving wife, Anna. And as he was crossing the Atlantic, the captain told everybody, this is the exact spot the ship went down just not too long before this. And he realized he was now over the very waters where his daughters had passed. And he was standing out on the boat looking at the stars. And instead of responding with anger and bitterness, he began to just pray to God that there was purpose. And that even though he was hurting, God still had a reason for his life. And he wrote the hymn, "It is well within my soul," as the ship passed the spot where his very own daughters had passed. And this story reflects a lot of what we read in this verse. No matter how dark it is, no matter the loss, God's faithfulness remains. That verse meant a lot to Horatio. It meant a lot to Bob Greene. It meant a lot to Rosemary and Luther, who all experienced devastating losses. Yet they clung tight. And they sought God's faithfulness every morning to help them navigate the pain and the understanding. And even though no one may fully ever understand why bad things can happen to good people, the truth is God remains faithful and his plan remains superior to all. So what can this verse mean for each of us in these times? You ever felt crushed by your own mistakes? I just brought it upon myself. You ever felt extreme grief or hopelessness when something you can't control goes bad and you or a family member or somebody you love is hurt deeply? we have to remember that in this verse, God's mercy is not run out. You're not out of God's grace today. Today's a new day, and His faithfulness will carry you forward. You see, in today's world, it's real easy to get caught up in death scrolling on your phone, the old death scroll, nonstop. We're all going to pass away with calluses on our index finger. And you just get caught up and you lose track of time. And those algorithms just pull you in deeper. And then you put your phone down, you click on the TV to take a break, and we're in this 24-hour news cycle of war and death and anger and division. And it just wants to pull you down into such a deep despair. And we have to remind ourselves, God is still in control. And God is faithful. And He's weaving everything together for His purpose. In the movie, I can only imagine, they asked the question, what do you do when you write the greatest song of all time and now you got nothing left? You still feel empty and your life's still struggling. And He had an answer. You just hang on. So what do you do out there today if the news and the darkness of the world and whatever you might be going through and the pain, if you're not, you know somebody it probably is. So what do you do when things seem dark and depressed? You just hang on. And you remember this verse. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. We're going to close in a word of prayer today, and I found a prayer that was actually tied to this verse, and I thought it was so appropriate for not only today's message, but the time period we're in the world. So let's just bow our heads, and I'm just going to read this prayer out loud for each of us and just let the words sink in. Thank you, Lord, that I've made it to the middle of the week, and I recognize that it was your grace that carried me here. Some of us are in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a battle, in the middle of uncertainty, but we are not in the middle alone. You are right here with us. Lord, when we feel stuck between what was and what will be, remind us that you are working in the middle. You're working in the chaos and the storm. When the storm feels loud and the battle feels intense, steady our hearts and quiet our minds. Help us not to panic in the process or to lose faith in the waiting. Thank you that the middle is not the end of our story. Thank you that what feels like pressure is producing growth, endurance, and a deeper trust in you. Fight the battles we don't have the strength to fight. Calm every storm that's trying to shake our peace. Today we choose faith over fear. We choose trust over worry. We believe you are turning this battle into a testimony and this storm into a stepping stone. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a blessed week, and we'll see you next Wednesday.